At 7:28 a.m. on the morning of July 24th, 1915, the steamship Eastland was moored at the Clark Street dock on the Chicago River. The weather was overcast but mild. The ship had been chartered for the annual summer picnic of the Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works. Thousands of employees and their families had gathered on the dock, waiting to board. The Eastland was one of 5 excursion vessels scheduled to carry the crowd up the river to the picnic grounds in Michigan City, Indiana. The ship had been at the dock since 6:30 a.m., taking on passengers. By 7:10, around 2,500 people had already come aboard. The ship was built to carry a maximum of 2,572 passengers and crew combined. That number would be reached within minutes. At 7:20, the Eastland started to list slightly to port, the side facing away from the dock. Passengers on the upper decks noticed the tilt. Some moved to the starboard side to balance the ship. Others dismissed it as nothing unusual. The list corrected itself briefly. Then it returned, deeper this time. By 7:25, the list was noticeable to crew members on the lower decks. The ship's chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, ordered the water ballast tanks to be pumped on the starboard side to counter the tilt. The pumps were started. The list did not stop. At 7:27, the Eastland was listing so sharply that water began to pour in through open gangways on the port side. The gangways were doors cut into the hull at the main deck level, used for loading passengers. They were only a few feet above the waterline. As the ship leaned further, the port gangway dipped below the river surface. A 42,000-gallon ballast tank on the port side was already full. The starboard ballast tanks were empty. The ship had been modified earlier that year with the addition of lifeboats, which added weight to the upper decks. The Eastland had never been stable. This morning, something was off. At 7:28, the ship rolled past its point of no return. The port side gangway was now fully submerged. Water flooded into the lower decks at a rate that overwhelmed the bilge pumps. Passengers on the port side scrambled to climb toward the starboard rail. On the upper deck, people grabbed whatever they could, railings, ropes, each other. The ship was not moving. It was still tied to the dock. The mooring lines held as the Eastland slowly turned on its side. At 7:30, the ship capsized completely. It came to rest on its port side in the river, only 20 feet from the dock. The starboard side faced up, but the hull was only a few feet above the water. Inside the ship, passengers were trapped in a tumbling, drowning darkness. The river was only 20 feet deep at that point, but the ship's width was 58 feet. It lay on its side, its superstructure half submerged. People on the dock watched in horror as the vessel went over. Within 2 minutes, the Eastland had gone from a steady list to a complete roll. What happened in the next minutes is not a matter of precise timestamps. It is a matter of chaos. Survivors later described the sound of metal groaning, of glass shattering, of people screaming. Those on the upper decks who managed to jump or fall into the river were pulled under by the current or by the suction of the sinking hull. Others clung to the exposed side of the ship. Bystanders on the dock threw ropes, ladders, and anything that floated. The water temperature was around 65 degrees. The current was strong. Within 10 minutes, the first rescue boats arrived. The fire department launched lifeboats. Nearby pleasure craft came alongside. But the Eastland had rolled so quickly and so completely that the vast majority of the passengers never had a chance to escape. By 8 a.m., the scale of the disaster was clear. Bodies were being pulled from the river and laid out on the dock. The dead were counted, then counted again. The final toll would be 844 people, men, women, and children. Most were employees of Western Electric and their families. Among the dead were 22 entire families. The youngest victim was an infant. The oldest was a 75-year-old man. The ship's crew numbered about 70. 30 of them died. Many of the victims were trapped inside the hull, which had become a steel tomb in the river. The Eastland Disaster is often remembered as the deadliest shipwreck in the Great Lakes, but it is more than that. It is a story of a ship that was flawed from its keel, of a regulatory system that ignored the physics of buoyancy, and of a tragedy that might have been prevented with a single ballast pump left running. To understand how a ship could roll over while still tied to a dock, we have to go back to the beginning. The Eastland was built in 1902 by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, Michigan. It was designed as a passenger steamer for the Great Lakes excursion trade, a booming business in the early 1900s. The ship was 265 feet long, with a beam of 58 feet and a depth of 19 feet. Its gross tonnage was 1.96 ton. It had a triple expansion steam engine that gave it a speed of about 16 knots. From the start, the Eastland had stability problems. The ship's hull shape was narrow and its freeboard, the distance from the waterline to the main deck, was low. In rough weather, the ship rolled heavily. In calm water, it listed unpredictably when passengers moved from one side to the other. The original owners, the Michigan Steamship Company, operated the Eastland on routes between Chicago and Michigan ports. Passengers complained of seasickness. The ship was top-heavy because its passenger cabins and promenade decks were built above the main deck, raising the center of gravity. To compensate, the builders added water ballast tanks along the keel, but the tanks were small. The Eastland could carry up to 335 tons of ballast water, but in practice, the ship rarely carried enough to fully stabilize it. The owners wanted speed, not stability. A fully ballasted ship sat lower in the water and was slower. So the Eastland sailed with empty or partially empty ballast tanks, relying on the weight of passengers and cargo to keep it upright. In 1903, after its first season, the ship was sold to the Chicago and South Haven Steamship Company. It continued to operate with the same design flaws. In 1906, the ship was chartered for a day trip. During the voyage, a sudden squall caused the Eastland to list sharply. Passengers panicked. The captain ordered the ship back to port. No official inquiry was held. The incident was noted in newspaper accounts, but no action was taken. The Eastland's worst stability test came in 1914, after the federal government passed the Seamen's Act, also known as the La Follette Act. The law was intended to improve safety conditions for merchant seamen. Among its provisions was a requirement that all passenger vessels carry enough lifeboats for every person on board. The Eastland had only a few lifeboats when the law was passed. To comply, the owners of the Eastland, now the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, added 6 new lifeboats and 6 life rafts to the upper deck. Each lifeboat weighed about 3 tons. The rafts were smaller but added to the top weight. The work was done in April 1905. The ship was then inspected by federal officials and approved for service. The inspection did not include a stability test. The new lifeboats were mounted on the roof of the passenger cabins, raising the ship's center of gravity further. No additional ballast was added to the lower hull to counterbalance the extra weight. In May 1915, 2 months after the modifications, the Eastland made a trial run with a full load of passengers. The ship listed heavily as soon as the passengers boarded. The captain ordered everyone to the starboard side. The list corrected, but the ship remained unstable. Later that same month, the ship was chartered for another excursion. Again, it listed dangerously. Passengers reported that the rail on the port side was only inches above the water when the ship was fully loaded. The owners were aware of the problem. They considered adding concrete ballast to the hull, but decided against it because it would reduce the ship's passenger capacity and speed. On July 14, 1915, 10 days before the disaster, the Eastland was docked at Chicago with a load of passengers. It listed so far that water came over the gangway. The ship's chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, later testified that he had warned the company's management that the ship was unsafe. He was ignored. Erickson was the same man who would be on duty on the morning of July 24th. On July 23rd, the day before the picnic, the Eastland was inspected by a United States Steamboat Inspection Service official. The inspection was routine. The official checked the lifeboats and fire equipment. He did not test the ship's stability. The ship was certified to carry 2,572 people. That was the number Western Electric used to plan the picnic. The Hawthorne Works employed about 8,000 people. About 7,000 signed up for the picnic. The excursion company divided them among 5 ships. The Eastland was the largest and would carry the most passengers, around 2,500. The morning of July 24th, passengers began boarding at 6:30 a.m. They came through 2 gangways, one on the port side and one on the starboard side. The port gangway was at the stern, the starboard gangway near the bow. Because the dock was on the north side of the Clark Street Bridge, the ship was moored with its starboard side against the dock. The port side faced the river. As passengers boarded, they naturally moved to the open spaces on the upper decks, which were on the port side, the side away from the dock. The ship began to list to port. The crew attempted to balance the ship by directing passengers to the starboard side. This worked temporarily, but every time a new group boarded, the list returned. The ship had a ballast system that could pump water between tanks on either side. The system was operated by a steam-powered pump in the engine room. The chief engineer, Erickson, ordered the starboard ballast tanks filled to counter the port list. The pump was started, but the pump had limited capacity. It could move about 700 gallons per minute. The starboard tanks could hold 42,000 gallons. Filling them would take nearly an hour. The ship was listing within minutes. At some point, exactly when is disputed, the pump was either stopped or slowed. Erickson later claimed he left the pump running. Other crew members said the pump was shut off because the ship's engineers thought the list had stabilized. The investigation would later determine that the pump was not running when the ship capsized. The starboard ballast tanks were empty. The port tanks were full. That imbalance, combined with the top-heavy weight of the passengers and the new lifeboats, was fatal. The physics of the Eastland's stability can be explained simply. A ship stays upright as long as its center of gravity remains below its metacenter, the point around which the hull rotates when it tilts. If the center of gravity rises above the metacenter, the ship becomes unstable. A small tilt will then cause the ship to continue rolling. The addition of the lifeboats on the upper deck raised the Eastland's center of gravity by several inches. The lack of ballast water in the starboard tanks meant the ship had no restoring force when it tilted to port. The passengers moving to the starboard side only delayed the inevitable. Once the list passed about 15 degrees, the port side gangway dipped underwater. Water poured in. The ship had no watertight compartments to slow the flooding. The portside ballast tanks were already full, so the ship could not compensate by flooding them further. The weight of the incoming water pulled the ship down even faster. The entire roll took about 90 seconds from the time the first gangway was submerged. When the ship came to rest, the starboard side was above water, but the hull was not intact. The main deck was now vertical. The port side was buried in the mud at the bottom of the river. Survivors clung to the exposed starboard side. Inside the hull, the interior was a labyrinth of sideways corridors and collapsed furniture. Many of the dead were trapped in the lower cabins, where the windows were below the waterline. Drowning was the cause of death for almost all victims. Rescue efforts were hampered by the ship's position. It lay at an angle with the bow slightly higher than the stern. Divers could not reach the port side because of the hull's weight. Cutting torches were brought in to open holes in the hull. By late afternoon, the last survivors were pulled out, but the recovery of bodies would take weeks. What investigators later found was a chain of failures that stretched from the shipyard to the regulatory agency. The Seamen's Act of 1914 required lifeboats, but it did not require stability tests after the boats were installed. The U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service was underfunded and understaffed. Its inspectors were often retired mariners who relied on experience rather than calculations. The Eastland's stability had never been formally computed. No one had calculated the effect of adding 6 lifeboats to the upper deck. If they had, the numbers would have been alarming. The ship's original design had a metacentric height, the distance between the center of gravity and the metacenter, of about 6 inches, which was already low. After the lifeboats were added, that value dropped to near zero. On the morning of July 24th, with passengers crowded on the upper decks, the metacentric height likely became negative. The ship was unstable from the moment the first passenger stepped aboard. The disaster prompted immediate changes in maritime safety regulations. The federal government passed the Motorboat Act of 1916 and the subsequent regulations requiring stability calculations for all passenger vessels. The U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service was reorganized. The Eastland itself was raised from the river in August 1915, repaired, and sold to the United States Navy, which converted it into a training vessel renamed the USS Wilmette. The ship operated for another 3 decades, but it never carried passengers again. It was scrapped in 1948, but the human toll of the Eastland disaster cannot be measured in regulations or tonnage. The Western Electric Picnic was an annual event that families looked forward to for months. Many of the victims were immigrants who worked in the company's factories. The Hawthorne Works was one of the largest industrial plants in the world. The picnic was a celebration of community. On that morning, more than 800 people went to the dock and did not come back. The disaster remains the deadliest single-day loss of life in Chicago history. It is also one of the least remembered, overshadowed by the sinking of the Titanic 3 years earlier and the outbreak of the First World War. Why did the Eastland roll? The answer is not a mystery. It was a ship with a design that was barely stable when empty, made worse by the addition of lifeboats, operated on a morning when the ballast system failed, and loaded with passengers who moved to one side. The question that remains unanswered is not how, but why the system allowed it. The inspection that morning should have caught the list. The captain should have ordered the ship to be evacuated. The crew should have kept the ballast pumps running. None of that happened. The investigation later found that the ship's captain, Harry Pedersen, had been ashore at the time. He was delayed by a phone call. The first mate, Bernhard Hansen, was in charge. Hansen did not recognize the danger until it was too late. The ship had listed before. It had always come back. This time, it did not. The Eastland disaster is a lesson in the gap between regulation and reality. The Seamen's Act was well-intentioned. It was passed to protect sailors from exploitation and to ensure life-saving equipment was available, but it was written without considering the physics of small vessels. The law applied to all passenger ships, but it treated stability as a fixed property rather than a variable one. The Eastland's owners complied with the law by adding lifeboats, but they did so in a way that made the ship more dangerous. The regulatory inspection did not test for stability because stability testing was not required. The system assumed that if a ship met the requirements on paper, it would be safe. That assumption was wrong. In the years that followed, the Eastland disaster became a case study in engineering schools and maritime courts. The lessons were technical: always calculate metacentric height, never add top weight without compensating ballast, test stability regularly. But the deeper lesson is about complacency. The Eastland had shown warning signs for years. Crew members knew it was unstable. Passengers knew it was unstable. But because it had never capsized before, no action was taken. The disaster happened because the people in charge believed that what had not happened could not happen. They were wrong. The ship that rolled at the dock is a reminder that the most dangerous assumption is that the next run will be like the last one. In the immediate aftermath of the capsizing, the rescue effort became a desperate scramble against time. At 7:38 a.m., the first police and fire boats arrived on the scene. They found a ship lying on its side, its exposed starboard hull rising 15 feet above the water. Survivors clung to the railing, the propeller, the rudder, and the deckhouses. Some had climbed onto the hull itself. The Chicago Fire Department's fireboat, the Graham Stewart, reached the Eastland at 7:41 a.m. Its crew began pulling people from the water and off the hull. But the fireboat could not get close enough to the port side, where the main deck was submerged. That area was a death trap. Hundreds of people were trapped inside the hull, in the lower cabins, the dining room, the cargo hold, and the engine room. The water was cold, dark, and thick with debris. The only way to reach the trapped passengers was to cut holes in the hull. At 7:53 a.m., the first cutting torches arrived from a nearby shipyard. They were used to burn through the steel plating of the starboard hull. The work was slow and dangerous. The torches produced intense heat and smoke. Inside the hull, the trapped passengers were already drowning or suffocating. The rescue teams could hear banging and screaming from within. They worked as fast as they could, but each hole took minutes to cut. By 8:15 a.m., the first holes were large enough for a man to crawl through. Rescuers entered the hull and found a scene of chaos. The interior was now a sideways labyrinth. Corridors were vertical, doors were underwater. Furniture had shifted and blocked passages. Bodies floated in the flooded compartments. Some survivors were still alive, wedged into air pockets. They were pulled out, but many died before they reached the surface. By 9 a.m., the rescue operation had shifted to body recovery. The number of confirmed dead was already in the hundreds. The city of Chicago mobilized every available resource. Morgues were set up on the dock. Temporary hospitals were established in nearby warehouses. The Red Cross set up a tent for families searching for loved ones. The identification process was slow and heart-wrenching. Many victims had no identification on them. They had left their wallets and purses on the dock or in the ship's lockers. The bodies were laid out in rows on the pier, covered with tarpaulins. Families walked through the rows, lifting the covers to see if they recognized a face. Some families found their loved ones. Others did not. The search for the missing would continue for weeks. The official death toll was eventually set at 844, but many historians believe the true number was higher. The passenger manifest was not complete. Some people had boarded without tickets. Children were often not listed. The count included 472 women and 290 men, with the rest being children. The youngest victim was a baby of 6 months. The oldest was a woman of 7 on. Of the 844 dead, 22 were entire families wiped out. Western Electric lost 660 employees and 178 family members. The Hawthorne Works lost a significant portion of its workforce. The company's headquarters building became a temporary morgue and relief center. The disaster destroyed not just lives, but the social fabric of the neighborhoods that fed the factory. How did a ship that never left the dock claim more than 800 lives? The answer lies in the design, the regulations, the crew, and the passengers, but also in the moments that preceded the roll. At 7:23 a.m., when the ship first listed to port, the crew tried to correct it by moving passengers to the starboard side. They also tried to pump ballast, but the pump was not working properly. The ship's engineer, Joseph Erickson, was in the engine room. He later testified that he had started the ballast pump at 7:20 a.m., but that the pump was slow and the water level in the starboard tanks was not dropping quickly enough. He claimed he left the pump running when he went to check the list, but other crew members said the pump was stopped because the engineers thought the list had stabilized. The investigation later found that the pump was not running when the ship capsized. The starboard tanks were still empty. The port tanks were full. That imbalance was the final push, but there were earlier warnings that went unheeded. The Eastland had a history of instability. It had rolled slightly in previous seasons. In 1913, during a trial run, the ship had listed so badly that water came over the port side. The captain at that time, Harry Pedersen, had ordered the ship back to dock, but the incident was not reported to the steamboat inspectors. The ship's owners, the St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company, were aware of the problem. They had installed a system of ballast tanks to correct the list, but the system was manual and slow. The crew was not trained to use it effectively. The ship's stability had never been calculated. No one knew what the safe load was for the vessel. The only rule was that the ship should not list more than 10 degrees. On July 24th, the list passed that threshold in seconds. The investigation that followed was conducted by the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service and the Illinois state government. Hearings began in August 1915 and lasted for months. The first question was who was responsible. The captain, Harry Pedersen, was ashore at the time of the roll. He had been delayed by a phone call. He testified that he had left the ship in charge of the first mate, Bernhard Hansen. Hansen was on the bridge when the roll began. He ordered passengers to move to the starboard side, but that only delayed the roll. When the ship reached 15 degrees, he ordered the gangways to be cut loose. But it was too late. The ship was already past the point of no return. The first mate was later charged with negligence, but the case was eventually dropped. The owners of the ship were also investigated. They had complied with the Seamen's Act by adding lifeboats and rafts. But they had not tested the ship's stability after the modifications. The inspectors from the Steamboat Inspection Service were called to testify. They admitted that they had not inspected the Eastland on the morning of the disaster. They had accepted the previous year's inspection as valid. That inspection had not included a stability test because stability tests were not required. The inspectors were not engineers. They were retired sailors who relied on experience. The system was based on trust, not data. The hearings also revealed that the Eastland had been overloaded that morning. The ship was licensed to carry 2,570 passengers, but only about 2,500 had boarded. The weight was within limits on paper, but the distribution of that weight was the problem. Most passengers were on the upper decks, waiting for the ship to depart. The lifeboats were on the roof of the upper deck. The added weight of those boats, combined with the passenger concentration, raised the center of gravity to a dangerous level. The ballast system was not used to correct the list because the crew did not understand the physics. They thought the list was normal. They had seen it before. This time was different. The investigation concluded with a series of recommendations. The federal government passed the Motorboat Act of 1916, which required stability calculations for all passenger vessels. The Steamboat Inspection Service was reorganized and given more authority. The inspectors were required to be trained in naval architecture. The Eastland Disaster became a textbook example of ship stability in maritime engineering courses, but the changes took time. In the meantime, the ship itself was raised from the river. Raising the Eastland was a massive engineering operation. The ship lay on its side in 20 feet of water. The hull was embedded in the mud. The recovery team used cables and hydraulic jacks to pull the ship upright. On August 14, 1915, the Eastland was finally righted. The operation took 2 weeks. When the hull was lifted, the bodies of more than 200 victims were discovered trapped inside. They had been missed in the initial recovery because the water was too muddy and the compartments were too difficult to reach. The discovery brought renewed grief to the families. The bodies were removed and identified as best as possible. Then the ship was pumped dry and towed to a shipyard. The Eastland was repaired and sold to the U.S. Navy, which converted it into a training vessel. The ship was renamed the USS Wilmette. The Navy removed the lifeboats that had been the original cause of the instability. The ship was refitted with a new ballast system and a lower center of gravity. The Wilmette served as a training ship for naval reservists on the Great Lakes for the next 3 decades. During World War II, it was used to train gunners and engineers. The ship that had killed more than 800 people in peacetime became a tool of war training. It was decommissioned in 1945 and scrapped in 1948. The steel was recycled. The ship's name was forgotten, but the human legacy of the Eastland disaster did not fade. The families of the victims filed lawsuits against the ship's owners, the Western Electric Company, and the U.S. government. The lawsuits were settled out of court, with the owners paying a total of about $500,000 to the families. That amount was far less than the value of the lost lives. Many families received only a few $100s. The disaster also led to the creation of the Chicago chapter of the American Red Cross, which provided aid to the survivors. The city built a memorial park near the dock, but it was later demolished. Today, the site is a parking lot for a shopping mall. Why is the Eastland disaster so little known? The answer is partly timing. The disaster occurred less than 3 years after the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic was a global story, with a dramatic narrative of a ship hitting an iceberg, heroic sailors, and a sinking in the middle of the Atlantic. The Eastland was a mundane story of a ship rolling over in a river, in a city, in front of hundreds of spectators. The Titanic had 1,500 deaths, but the Eastland had 8 for. That is a significant number, but it was overshadowed by the outbreak of World War I, which began a few days after the disaster. The war dominated the headlines. The Eastland story was pushed to the inside pages. Over time, it faded from public memory. But for those who study maritime safety, the Eastland remains a cautionary tale. It is a lesson about the unintended consequences of regulation. The Seamen's Act was designed to protect passengers by requiring lifeboats, but it did not consider that adding weight to the upper deck of a small vessel could make it unstable. The law did not require stability tests. The inspectors did not look for instability. The crew did not understand the danger. The passengers did not know they were in a death trap. The disaster happened because of a gap between what the law required and what the ship needed. The Eastland disaster also highlights the importance of human factors. The crew knew the ship was unstable. The captain had complained about the list in the past, but no one acted on that knowledge because the ship had always recovered. Complacency is a powerful force. It dulls the perception of risk. The Eastland rolled because the people in charge believed that what had not happened could not happen. That assumption was fatal. Today, the Eastland is remembered in Chicago through a memorial plaque, a documentary film, and books. The names of the victims are listed on the Chicago History Museum's website. Every year, a small group of descendants and historians gather at the site to mark the anniversary. The disaster is taught in engineering schools as an example of how a ship can capsize at the dock. It is a reminder that safety is not a checkbox. It is a continuous process of evaluation, calculation, and vigilance. The Eastland disaster of 1915 was not an accident in the sense of a random event. It was the result of a predictable chain of failures. The ship was built on a flawed design. The lifeboats were added without consideration of stability. The ballast system was inadequate and poorly operated. The crew was not trained to recognize the danger. The inspection did not catch the problem. The regulations did not require it. And the passengers, trusting the ship and the crew, boarded and paid for a journey that never began. What remains is the question of how many more tragedies like this are waiting to happen, even today. The Eastland is a historical event, but the conditions that caused it, regulatory gaps, lack of training, complacency, and the assumption that the next run will be like the last, are not confined to one fiv. They are present in every form of transportation, every industrial process, every building. The Eastland is a mirror held up to the systems we trust. It shows us that trust must be earned by rigorous questioning, not granted by habit. The ship that rolled at the dock is a monument to the cost of that habit. The 844 dead are not just numbers. They are engineers and seamstresses, immigrants and native-born, teachers and factory workers. They were on their way to a picnic. They had sandwiches in their pockets. They had tickets in their hands. They never arrived. The Eastland disaster is the story of a perfect storm of failure, and it is a story that must be told so that the same storm does not gather again. But the story does not end with the raising of the ship or the settlements. The Eastland disaster forced a reckoning with how America regulated its waterways, and that reckoning unfolded over years, in courtrooms, in engineering classrooms, and in the quiet grief of families who never fully recovered. In the months after the disaster, the families of the victims filed more than 200 lawsuits against the St. Joseph, Chicago Steamship Company, the owners of the Eastland. They argued that the company knew the ship was unstable and had failed to take corrective action. They also sued the Western Electric Company, the employer of most of the passengers, for chartering an unsafe vessel. But the legal system was unprepared for a mass casualty event of this scale. There was no precedent for compensating 844 families. The cases were consolidated into a single federal proceeding. The judge appointed a special master to review the evidence. The hearings dragged on for years. Insurance companies fought every claim. They argued that the disaster was an act of God, that the ship had been seaworthy, that the passengers had assumed the risk by boarding. The families had to prove negligence, not just tragedy, and negligence is hard to prove when the entire system was negligent. In the end, the steamship company was found liable, but the company had limited assets. The insurance policies covered only a fraction of the losses. By 1919, 4 years after the disaster, the court approved a settlement fund of about $500,000. That sounds like a large sum, but divided among more than 800 families, it worked out to roughly $600 per victim. Adjusted for inflation, that is about $15,000 today. But in 1919, $600 did not replace a husband, a father, a mother, a child. Many families received nothing because they could not afford to hire lawyers or because they missed the filing deadlines. The injustice of the compensation deepened the trauma. Working-class families of the Western Electric employees had lost their breadwinners. Many had no savings, no life insurance. The disaster left hundreds of children as orphans or half-orphans. The Chicago Tribune reported that within a year, more than a dozen widows had been forced to give up their homes. Some moved in with relatives. Others entered poorhouses. The social safety net in 1915 was almost non-existent. The Red Cross provided temporary relief, but the help ran out. The psychological impact was also measured, though poorly understood at the time. Survivors experienced what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. They had flashbacks of the water rising, of bodies pressing against them, of the darkness inside the hull. Many could not return to work. Some refused to ever board a ship again. The children who survived, those who had been held above the water by strangers or who had climbed out through portholes, carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Decades later, in oral histories collected by the Chicago History Museum, they described the sound of screams and the feeling of cold water. Among the survivors was a young woman named Mary H. She was 22 years old, a seamstress at Western Electric. She had boarded the Eastland with her sister and her mother. When the ship rolled, they were separated. Mary was trapped under a bench, but the bench floated and created an air pocket. She was rescued after 45 minutes. Her mother was found dead. Her sister survived with a broken arm. Mary never married. She lived alone in a small apartment on the south side. She did not speak about the disaster until her 90th birthday, when a reporter interviewed her. She said, "I still see her face in the water. I cannot forget." The disaster also changed how engineers and naval architects thought about ship stability. Before the Eastland, the standard method for assessing a ship's stability was the inclining test, but it was not required for all vessels. The Seamen's Act had focused on lifeboats, not on how those lifeboats affected the ship's center of gravity. After the Eastland, the U.S. government mandated that every passenger vessel must undergo an inclining test before receiving a certificate of inspection. The test is simple in concept. A known weight is moved a known distance across the deck, and the resulting angle of heel is measured. That measurement gives the ship's metacentric height, the distance between the center of gravity and the metacenter. If that height is too small, the ship is unstable. The Eastland's metacentric height, had it been calculated, would have been dangerously low. The addition of the lifeboats and the top-heavy passenger load had pushed the center of gravity above the metacenter. The ship had zero positive stability. It was a floating trap, but no one calculated it because no regulation required it. In the years following the disaster, the Steamboat Inspection Service began training its inspectors in naval architecture. They were sent to the Webb Institute and the University of Michigan. They learned to read stability curves, to calculate freeboard, to evaluate ballast systems. By 1920, the service had doubled its staff. The number of vessel inspections increased. The number of marine accidents dropped. But the Eastland's legacy is not only about engineering. It is also about the human tendency to normalize risk. The crew of the Eastland had seen the list before. They had watched the ship lean to starboard on previous trips. They had adjusted by moving passengers or by adding ballast, but only as a temporary fix. They never asked why. They never demanded a formal stability test. They trusted the ship because it had always returned to upright. That trust was misplaced. The same pattern appears in other disasters. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded because engineers had warned about the O-rings in cold weather. But the launch went ahead because previous launches had survived cold temperatures. The Deepwater Horizon blew out because pressure tests were interpreted as successful when they were not. The Boeing 737 MAX crashed because pilots were not trained on a new system, and the system itself had been designed to trust a single sensor. In each case, people saw a warning sign and interpreted it as normal. The Eastland is the original example of that fallacy. The disaster also reveals the limits of regulation as a response. The Seamen's Act was a good law. It was intended to save lives, but it was applied without understanding the physics of the ships it regulated. The government mandated lifeboats, but it did not mandate stability. The shipbuilders added the lifeboats, but they did not recalculate the stability. The inspectors checked the number of lifeboats, but they did not check whether the ship could stay upright with those lifeboats aboard. The law created a false sense of safety. The passengers died because they trusted the law. This is a lesson that is still relevant. Every regulation has unintended consequences. The key is to look for them before they become fatal. That requires testing, simulation, and a willingness to question the rule. It requires engineers and inspectors who go beyond the checklist. The Eastland disaster showed that a checklist is only as good as the understanding behind it. Over the years, the Eastland disaster has been remembered in different ways. In 1916, a year after the disaster, the city of Chicago dedicated a memorial plaque at the Clark Street Bridge. It was a small bronze tablet with the names of the victims. The plaque was removed during a bridge renovation in the 1950s and never replaced. A new plaque was installed in 1989 at the Chicago Riverwalk, but it is easy to miss. The site of the disaster is now a parking lot for a shopping center. There is no monument, no museum, no permanent exhibit. The Eastland is a ghost in the city's memory, but the families remember. Every year on July 24th, a small group of descendants gathers at the river to lay flowers. They read the names aloud. The list takes more than an hour. Some of them travel from other states. They bring photographs of ancestors they never met. They tell stories passed down through generations. One descendant, a woman named Carol, said in an interview that her great-grandmother lost 3 daughters on the Eastland. The family never fully recovered. My grandmother would not allow anyone in the family to go near the Chicago River, she said. She never said why. It was just a rule. We didn't understand until we found the old newspaper clippings. The disaster also had a lasting effect on the labor movement. The Western Electric employees who died were mostly union members. The Hawthorne Works plant had a strong union, and the loss of so many workers weakened the organizing effort for years. The company, in an attempt to show goodwill, set up a relief fund and built a memorial building in Cicero. But the building was later sold. The company's records of the disaster were lost in a fire. The Union archives were destroyed. The Eastland disaster is now studied in safety engineering courses as a case study in systemic failure. It is used to teach the concept of the Swiss cheese model, where layers of defense each have a hole, and when the holes align, the accident happens. The Eastland had many layers: the flawed design, the added lifeboats, the missing ballast, the untrained crew, the inadequate inspection, the overconfidence of the captain, the lack of stability test. Each layer had a hole. On July 24, 1915, all the holes lined up. But the disaster is not only a technical lesson. It is also a human story. The 844 victims were not a single demographic. They were a cross-section of Chicago's working class. The manifest listed names like Kowalski, O'Brien, Schmidt, Pappas, and Lee. They were immigrants from Poland, Ireland, Germany, Greece, and China. They were native-born Americans from rural Illinois who had moved to the city for work. They were women and men, young and old. The youngest victim was a 2-month-old baby named Margaret. The oldest was a 74-year-old retired carpenter named John. They all left home that morning expecting a day of sunshine and a beer on the shore. They did not return. The disaster also exposed the inequalities of the legal system. The wealthier families were able to hire lawyers and pursue claims. Some received settlements as high as $10,000. The poorer families received nothing. The insurance companies used the families' poverty against them. They delayed proceedings, hoping the families would give up. Many did. The disaster became a lesson in how the system treats the poor. It was not an accident that the victims were mostly factory workers. Over the decades, the Eastland disaster faded from popular memory. The Titanic story grew larger with each passing year. The Lusitania sinking was remembered as a war crime. The Eastland was a footnote, a ship that capsized in a river, not at sea, a disaster that happened in peacetime, not in war, a tragedy that had no villains, only a chain of unfortunate decisions. It did not fit the narrative of heroism or malice. It was a story of mediocrity and neglect. But the Eastland disaster is more important than the Titanic in some ways. The Titanic was a freak event, an iceberg in an unexpected location, a ship going too fast, a failure of communication. The Eastland was a predictable event, a ship that was always unstable, a regulation that was poorly written, a crew that did not understand their own vessel. The Titanic changed lifeboat regulations. The Eastland changed the entire approach to ship stability. The Titanic killed rich people, the Eastland killed poor people. The rich get memorials, the poor get parking lots. In the 1960s, a group of historians and divers tried to locate the wreck of the Eastland. They found it, but it was gone. The ship had been scrapped. They searched for sunken artifacts and found only a few pieces of metal and a broken plate. The river had taken everything. The only physical remnants are a few life preservers and a single porthole in the Chicago Historical Society. They are displayed in a small case near the back of the museum. Most visitors walk past them without stopping, but the story endures in the archives. The Illinois State Archives hold the coroner's inquest records, including transcripts of testimony from survivors and witnesses. The testimony fills more than 3,000 pages. In those pages, you can hear the voices of the people who were there. The captain insisting he did nothing wrong, a deckhand describing how the water came up so fast he had to climb a rope, a woman saying she held her sister's hand until the hand went limp. The inquest did not assign criminal blame. It concluded that the disaster was an act of God, but with human negligence as a contributing cause. That was a legal compromise, but it was also an accurate description of a system that had failed. The narrative of the Eastland disaster is not a clean story. It does not have a clear villain or a triumphant ending. It is a story about how ordinary people died because ordinary people did not do their jobs. The captain was not a monster. He was a man who believed the ship was safe because it had always been safe. The inspector was not corrupt. He was a man who checked the boxes on his form without asking questions. The designer was not malicious. He was a man who built a ship that passed the tests of the time. The passengers were not naive. They were people who trusted the system. The system failed them. In the final analysis, the Eastland disaster is a warning about the gap between what we think we know and what we actually know. We think the ship is stable because it does not tip over. We think the bridge is safe because it does not collapse. We think the plane will fly because it flew yesterday. But safety is not a past performance. It is a calculation based on present conditions. The Eastland had a history of listing, and that history was interpreted as proof of safety, not as a warning sign. The disaster happened because people confused familiarity with safety. That mistake is still made today. Airplanes crash after thousands of safe flights. Bridges fall after decades of use. Ships capsize after years of service. The Eastland reminds us that every system has a weak point. The weak point is often the assumption that the system is safe. Today, maritime regulations are stricter. The International Load Line Convention, the Safety of Life at Sea Treaty, and the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations all require detailed stability analyses for passenger vessels. Modern ships are designed with computers that simulate every loading condition. The crew is trained in stability principles. The lifeboats are still required, but they are designed to be lightweight and low to the deck. The Eastland's fatal design, heavy lifeboats on the top deck, would never be permitted today. But the underlying problem persists, the gap between rules and reality. The Eastland disaster also raises a question that has no easy answer. How do we make safety rules that account for the complex interaction of variables? The Seamen's Act was a simple rule. Every passenger vessel must have enough lifeboats for every person on board. That simple rule created a complex failure. The rule did not consider the ship's stability because stability is not simple. It depends on shape, weight distribution, ballast, free surface effect, and a dozen other factors. To make a simple rule that covers all those factors is impossible, so regulators must rely on professional judgment. But judgment can be wrong. The Eastland is a case of judgment being wrong across an entire chain of command. No one chose to be negligent. They chose to be confident. The difference is subtle, but the result is fatal. In the years after the disaster, the U.S. Navy incorporated the Eastland's lessons into its own design standards. The Navy required inclining tests for all new vessels. The Navy also required that ballast tanks be used on every voyage, not just when the ship felt unsteady. The Navy's approach was to treat stability as a continuous requirement, not a once-a-year inspection. That approach saved lives during World War II, when thousands of troops were transported on converted ships. The Navy's stability officers were trained to calculate the center of gravity before every departure. They did not rely on the feel of the ship. The Eastland disaster was also used as a case study in the U.S. Coast Guard's Marine Safety Training Program. The Coast Guard still teaches it today. The lesson is that stability is not intuitive. A ship that feels safe can still capsize. A ship that has never capsized can still be unstable. The only way to know is to calculate. The crew of the Eastland did not calculate, they felt, and they were wrong. The feeling of safety is not the same as being safe. The Eastland disaster is a permanent reminder of that truth. As the summer of 1915 turned to autumn, the Chicago River returned to its normal traffic. The wreck was cleared, the bodies were buried, the lawsuits were filed. The news cycle moved on. The world was at war. The Eastland disaster, so enormous in the moment, became a small story in a larger conflict. But for the families, the war did not matter. The fight was personal. The pain was private. And the question remained, could it have been prevented? The answer, known to every naval architect today, is yes. The Eastland could have been made stable with a simple change. Fill the ballast tanks before the passengers boarded. That would have lowered the center of gravity by enough to keep the ship upright. The ballast tanks were there. They were empty because the crew did not know they needed to fill them. They did not understand the physics. They thought the list was caused by the wind, not by weight. They were wrong. The Eastland disaster is a tragedy of knowledge that was available but not used. The principles of stability had been known for decades. The French naval architect Pierre Bouguer had defined the metacenter in Once Event for 6. The English engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel had designed ships with careful stability calculations in the 1840s. The U.S. Navy had been using inclining tests since the 1880s. The knowledge existed. It just did not reach the Eastland. That is the lesson that still matters. Knowledge is not enough. It must be transferred to the people who need it. It must be embedded in regulations, in training, and everyday practice. The Eastland disaster shows what happens when knowledge sits on a shelf while people rely on habit and guesswork. The ship rolls, the people drown, and the world moves on. Today, the Eastland disaster is a footnote in most history books. But for the families, for the engineers, for the safety professionals who study it, it is a story about the cost of not asking the next question. Why is the ship listing? What happens if we add more weight? What is the center of gravity? How much ballast do we need? These questions were not asked in 1905. They are asked now. The Eastland disaster made sure of that. The ship itself is gone. The steel was melted down and repurposed. The river flows as it did before. The city has changed. But the disaster remains, not as a monument, but as a warning. It is a warning that the line between a normal day and a catastrophe is thinner than we think. It is a warning that the systems we trust can fail in ways we never imagined. And it is a warning that the people we put in charge may not know what they do not know. The Eastland disaster of 1915 is not history. It is a mirror, and in that mirror we see ourselves. At 10 in the morning on July 24, 1915, the Chicago River was no longer a waterway. It was a crime scene, a rescue site, and a mass grave all at once. The Eastland was on its side, its port hull pressed against the mud of the riverbed. The starboard side was exposed to the air, a wall of steel painted white with Eastland in black letters now tilted at a 90-degree angle. Hundreds of people were still inside. Hundreds more were on the dock, wet, screaming, or silent. The rescue effort had already begun within seconds of the capsize, but the scale of the task was just becoming clear. By 10:15, the first fireboats arrived. They sprayed water not to fight a fire but to cool the hull and to wash away the oil slick that was spreading across the surface. The oil came from the ship's fuel tanks, ruptured when the hull twisted. It mixed with the water, making the surface slick and poisonous. Rescuers had to work through it. They used axes, crowbars, and sledgehammers to break through the hull. They cut holes in the metal. They reached into dark compartments filled with water and bodies. They pulled out children, women, men. Some were alive, most were not. At 10:30, the U.S. Navy tugboat Wahoo arrived with a team of divers. One diver, a 20-year-old named John O'Leary, went down into the submerged cabins. He reported later that the water was so murky he could barely see his own hand. He felt his way along corridors, searching for survivors. He found none. The cabins were filled with the dead, their bodies floating in the darkness. O'Leary surfaced, changed his tank, and went back down. He would make 4 more dives that day. By 11 o'clock, the city had set up a temporary morgue in the 2nd Regiment Armory on Washington Boulevard. Wagons lined up outside, each carrying a load of bodies wrapped in blankets or tarps. The coroner, Dr. Peter Hoffman, had been called at 9:40 and had arrived at the river by 10. He saw the scene and immediately realized the magnitude. He ordered every available wagon, every ambulance, every hearse in the city to report to the dock. By noon, the armory floor was covered with rows of bodies laid out on blankets. The smell of wet wool and oil and blood began to fill the building. Volunteers were called in to help with identification. Families came to the armory, walking between the rows, looking for their loved ones. The process was slow and brutal. Many of the dead had no visible injuries. They had drowned in a few feet of water, their lungs filled with river water mixed with oil. Some had been crushed by furniture or by other bodies. Some were children still clutching the hands of their mothers. The coroner's staff worked through the night. By dawn on July 25th, they had identified about half of the bodies. The rest would take days, some weeks. A special detail was assigned to the children. The Eastland had carried many families from the factory neighborhoods. Whole families had perished. In some cases, no one was left alive to identify the children. The coroner used photographs and personal effects, a locket, a shoe, a piece of ribbon. He asked the public to come to the armory and look at the faces of the unknown dead. It was a public spectacle, but it was also the only way to reunite the dead with their names. On July 26th, the Chicago City Council called for an immediate investigation. The mayor, William Hale Thompson, appointed a special committee, but the legal machinery was already moving faster. The Cook County coroner's inquest began on July 27th. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and family members. The first witness was Captain Harry Pedersen, the ship's master. He testified that he had felt the ship listing but believed it was caused by the wind. He said he had ordered the crew to fill the ballast tanks after the passengers were already on board, but it was too late. He could not explain why the ballast had not been filled earlier. He said it had never been done before. The inquest lasted 2 weeks. The coroner's jury heard from 38 witnesses, including naval architects, ship captains, Coast Guard officers, and crew members. They examined the design of the Eastland, the loading procedure, the history of the ship's stability problems. They learned that the ship had been listed as unstable by its own designer, that the ballast tanks had been known but not used, that the Seamen's Act had forced the addition of the heavy lifeboats, and that no stability calculation had ever been performed for the final configuration. On August 11th, the coroner's jury returned its verdict. It found that the disaster was caused by the instability of the ship due to the weight of the passengers and the lifeboats, that the ballast tanks should have been filled before boarding, and that the ship's officers were guilty of negligence. But the verdict carried no criminal penalty. It was a finding, not a sentence. The next step was the criminal trial. In October 1915, a grand jury indicted Captain Pedersen, Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson, and shipyard manager William Hull on charges of manslaughter. The trial began in Chicago in January 1906. The prosecution argued that the men had known the ship was unstable and had failed to take reasonable precautions. The defense argued that the disaster was an accident caused by an unforeseen combination of factors. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The testimony was detailed and often technical. Experts explained the concept of the metacenter, the effect of free surface water, the weight of the lifeboats. The jury listened but seemed confused. The prosecution had to simplify the physics. They used a model of the ship and a basin of water to demonstrate how adding weight above the center of gravity caused the vessel to tip. The jury watched. They understood the principle, but the question was not whether the ship had capsized. It was whether the men on trial had known the risk. Captain Pedersen took the stand in his own defense. He was a veteran of 30 years on the Great Lakes. He had commanded ships that carried thousands of passengers. He said he had never heard of the concept of metacenter. He had never performed a stability calculation. He had been trained to feel the ship, to watch the weather, to trust his instincts. His instincts told him the Eastland was safe. He admitted the ship listed, but said it always listed. He had not understood that a list can become a capsize when the conditions change. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On March 3, 1916, they returned a verdict of not guilty for all 3 men. The courtroom was divided. Some families wept. Others applauded. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed the case. The men walked free. Why did the jury acquit? Many observers believed the prosecution had failed to prove criminal intent. The law required the state to show that the men had acted with gross negligence or willful disregard. The defense successfully argued that the men had followed standard practice, that the disaster was a result of ignorance, not malice. The jury may have also been influenced by the fact that the shipbuilding industry and the maritime community closed ranks. No one wanted to admit that the system was broken. It was easier to call it an act of God, but the families did not accept that. In the years after the trial, many filed civil lawsuits against the owners of the Eastland, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, and against the shipyard. The lawsuits dragged on for years. Most were settled out of court for small amounts. The company had no money. It had filed for bankruptcy shortly after the disaster. The shipyard also went bankrupt. The men who held the liability had little to lose, yet the legal failure did not mean nothing changed. The U.S. Congress, already in session, saw the disaster as a direct result of the Seamen's Act. In 1916, the La Follette Seamen's Act was amended to require that lifeboat capacity be calculated in relation to the stability of the vessel. The amendment was a direct response to the Eastland. It required that any vessel carrying lifeboats above the main deck must provide a stability analysis. The law did not go far enough. It did not mandate ballast procedures, but it was a start. At the same time, the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service began a top-to-bottom review of all passenger vessels on the Great Lakes. Inspectors were sent to every port. They checked not only the lifeboats but also the ballast systems, the loading procedures, the stability calculations. They found dozens of ships with the same design flaw as the Eastland: narrow beam, high superstructure, heavy lifeboats. Those ships were ordered to undergo inclining tests. Some were retrofitted with additional ballast. Others were taken out of service. The Eastland disaster also changed the way maritime training was conducted. The U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and the Great Lakes Maritime Academy began teaching stability as a core subject. The curriculum included the Eastland as a case study. Cadets were taught to calculate the center of gravity, to account for free surface effect, to fill ballast tanks before boarding passengers. The lesson was simple: do not rely on feel, use math, but the most profound change was invisible. It was the change in the culture of safety. Before the Eastland, the maritime industry operated on tradition. The captain was the sole authority. He knew his ship. He did not need a manual. After the Eastland, that tradition was questioned. The idea that a seasoned captain could be wrong was unsettling, but the evidence was clear. The captain was wrong. The inspector was wrong. The designer was wrong. The entire system was wrong. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the nature of complex systems. A ship is not a simple object. It is a collection of interdependent parts. The hull shape interacts with the water. The weight distribution changes with every passenger who boards. The free surface in the tank shifts with every wave. The lifeboats add leverage. A small change in any variable can have a large effect on stability. The Eastland was designed at a time when those interactions were understood only by a few experts. The experts were not at the dock. The men at the dock relied on intuition. Intuition failed. The Eastland disaster is not a story about bad people. It is a story about a system that lacked feedback loops. The system told the captain that the ship was safe because it had not capsized before. That was a false signal. The system told the inspector that the ship was safe because it passed the paper test. That was a false signal. The system told the public that the ship was safe because it had a license. That was a false signal. The system had no way to detect the gap between appearance and reality. Modern engineers call this the normal accident theory. Complex systems will eventually fail in ways that are not predictable by the operators. The Eastland was a normal accident. It was caused not by a single mistake but by the combination of many normal decisions. Decide to add lifeboats, decide not to fill ballast, decide to board passengers quickly, decide to ignore the list, decide to trust the feel. Each decision was reasonable in isolation. Together, they were lethal. The Eastland disaster is still studied today in accident investigation courses. It is used as an example of how multiple small failures can align to produce a catastrophe. It is also used as an example of how hindsight biases our analysis. In hindsight, the disaster seems inevitable. The ship listed constantly. The ballast was empty. The lifeboats were heavy. The metacenter was low. But in real time, those facts were just background noise. The captain saw the list every day. He did not see a warning, he saw normalcy. That is the hardest lesson of the disaster. Normalcy can be dangerous. The most common cause of catastrophic failure is the belief that things are fine. The Eastland crew believed things were fine. They were wrong. And the world moved on. By 1917, the Eastland story was fading from the newspapers. World War I dominated the front pages. The trial was a memory. The families were left with their grief. A few memorials were erected. A small plaque was placed at the site of the disaster on the Chicago River. A monument was built in the Bohemian National Cemetery, where many of the victims were buried. The monument is a simple stone obelisk with the names of the dead. It stands today, surrounded by grass, facing the river that took their lives. In 1918, the wreck of the Eastland was raised from the river. It took months of work. The hull was sealed, water was pumped out, and the ship floated upright for the first time since the disaster. It was then towed to a shipyard where it was repaired and refitted. It was sold to the U.S. Navy and commissioned as the USS Wilton, a gunboat. It served on the Great Lakes during the war. After the war, it was sold again, renamed, and used as a passenger ferry under the name Eastland. It continued to operate for decades. It finally sank in 1947, not in disaster but in the scrapyard. The ship's lifeboats were also repurposed. Some were used as life rafts on other vessels. Others were sold as scrap. One of the lifeboats was donated to a museum in Michigan. It is still on display, a wooden boat with the name Eastland painted on its side. It is a reminder that the object that was supposed to save lives instead helped kill them. The disaster also changed the way we think about safety in public transportation. The Eastland was the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in American history, but it is not the most famous. The Titanic, which had occurred only 3 years earlier, captured the public imagination because it was a story of hubris and heroism. Eastland was a story of boredom and bureaucracy. It was not glamorous. It was not cinematic. It was just a ship that rolled over at the dock. That lack of drama is perhaps why the Eastland is so often forgotten. It does not fit the narrative of a tragedy that could have been avoided by better technology or more courageous leadership. It was avoided by a simple ballast tank. The technology existed. The knowledge existed. The leadership existed. What did not exist was the will to ask the question. Today, the Chicago River still flows through the city. The site of the disaster is marked by a small historical sign. It is easy to miss. Most people walking along the river have no idea that 844 people died in that water. The river looks quiet. It moves slowly. It is hard to imagine it as a place of death, but the families have not forgotten. Every year on July 24th, a memorial service is held at the Bohemian National Cemetery. The names are read aloud. Wreaths are placed. The children who died are remembered. The service is small. The number of attendees grows smaller each year as the generations pass. But the story continues through the books, the documentaries, the case studies. The Eastland disaster is not history. It is a mirror. And in that mirror, we see ourselves. We see ourselves in the captain who believed he knew his ship. We see ourselves in the inspector who checked the boxes. We see ourselves in the engineers who designed a ship that passed the test. We see ourselves in the passengers who trusted the system. We are all vulnerable to the same mistake, assuming that what has always happened will always happen. The Eastland disaster is a warning. It says that the line between safety and disaster is thin. It says that the systems we rely on can fail not because of a single catastrophic decision, but because of 1,000 small omissions. It says that we must ask the next question. Why is the ship listing? What happens if we add more weight? Where is the center of gravity? How much ballast do we need? These are not just nautical questions. They apply to every system we build: bridges, airplanes, power plants, hospitals, software. Every system has a center of gravity. Every system has a metacenter. Every system can capsize if the assumptions are not tested. The Eastland disaster happened on a calm morning in July 1905. It was not a storm. It was not a collision. It was not a fire. It was a ship that rolled over because the people in charge did not know what they did not know. That is the lesson, and it is still relevant. 100 years later, the U.S. Coast Guard issued a new rule requiring stability monitoring systems on certain passenger vessels. The rule was inspired in part by the Eastland. The systems use sensors to continuously calculate the center of gravity and alert the crew if the ship is becoming unstable. It is a simple idea. It was not implemented for a century. The delay tells us something about how hard it is to change habits. The Eastland disaster was a clear signal. It was a bright red warning light. But the maritime industry did not install the warning light until 100 years later. That is because safety improvements are not automatic. They require someone to push for them. They require someone to say that the old way is not good enough. Who said that after the Eastland? The families, the lawyers, the journalists, the reformers, but they were not in power. The people in power, the ship owners, the regulators, the inspectors, had every incentive to maintain the status quo. Change was expensive. Change was uncomfortable. Change required admitting that the system had failed. The Eastland disaster was a system failure. The system was not just the ship. It was the entire structure of regulation, inspection, training, and oversight. That structure failed because no one was looking at the whole picture. The inspector looked at lifeboats. The naval architect looked at stability. The captain looked at the weather. No one looked at the interaction. That is the real lesson of the Eastland. Complexity demands integration. We cannot solve complex problems by dividing them into separate boxes. The Eastland disaster was caused by a failure of integration. The lifeboats were added without considering the stability. The ballast was not filled because no one told the crew it was necessary. The passengers were boarded because the schedule demanded it. The system had no feedback loop that connected these decisions. Modern industry has tried to solve this problem with system safety engineering, hazard analysis, and risk assessment. But the same fundamental issue remains. Every organization has silos. The engineers talk to engineers. The operators talk to operators. The regulators talk to regulators. The gaps between silos are where accidents happen. The Eastland is a case study of gap failure. The gap between the designer who drew the ship and the captain who sailed it. The gap between the inspector who certified the lifeboats and the crew who stowed them. The gap between the law that required lifeboats and the reality that made them dangerous. Gaps cannot be closed by rules alone. They require communication. They require training. They require a culture that encourages questions. The Eastland crew did not ask questions because they did not think there was anything to ask. They were confident. Confidence is a dangerous fuel. It is what made the Eastland roll. It is what made the Titanic sink. It is what made the Challenger explode. It is what makes every accident possible. The opposite of confidence is not fear. It is humility. It is the recognition that we do not know everything. It is the willingness to check, to verify, to calculate, to ask. The Eastland disaster is a permanent invitation to humility. Every time an engineer designs a ship, a pilot flies a plane, or a doctor performs a surgery, they should ask, what am I not seeing? What assumption A am I making? What could go wrong that I have not considered? The answer will not always be the Eastland, but the question is always the same. On the morning of July 24, 1915, the people of Chicago woke up to a beautiful day. They dressed their children in their best clothes. They walked to the river. They boarded a ship. They trusted it. And it failed. The Eastland disaster is a mirror. Look into it. See your own assumptions. See your own confidence. See the gap between what you think you know and what you actually know. And then close that gap. That is the only way to keep the Eastland from happening again. In the days following July 24, 1915, Chicago transformed from a city of celebration to a city of grief. On July 25th, the coroner's office began the grim task of identifying the dead. The morgue, set up near the river, became a place of systematic identification. Families lined up. They described children, spouses, parents. They looked at photographs and personal effects. The process was slow. Many bodies were unrecognizable. Water and pressure had done damage, but the coroner's staff worked methodically. They recorded every detail. By July 28th, a temporary morgue at the 2nd Regiment Armory had received over 700 bodies. The city had not prepared for this scale. Body bags were improvised. Refrigeration was inadequate. Volunteers from the Red Cross and local churches stepped in. They helped with paperwork. They comforted the bereaved. They kept records of what was found on each victim. On July 30th, the first mass funeral was held at the Bohemian National Cemetery. Over 400 victims were buried in a single day. Most were Czech immigrants. The cemetery had to expand its grounds. The services were simple. Priests read names. Coffins were lowered. The crowd stood in silence. Then another service began. The legal aftermath started almost immediately. On August 10, 1915, a federal grand jury convened in Chicago to investigate the disaster. The target was the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, the owner of the Eastland and the American Shipbuilding Company, which had built her. The charges were negligence and manslaughter. The grand jury heard testimony from survivors, crew members, engineers, and naval architects. One of the first witnesses was Captain Harry Pedersen. He insisted he had done everything by the book. He said he had followed standard procedure for ballasting. He claimed the ship had been stable when he took command. He blamed the lifeboats. He blamed the design. He blamed the inspectors. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators found that the Eastland had a long history of listing problems. They found records from previous captains complaining about instability. They found maintenance logs showing that the ballast tanks had been modified. They found that the ship had been overloaded with passengers on the morning of the disaster. The ticket count exceeded legal capacity, but the company had knowingly boarded more people than allowed. On August 20th, the grand jury returned indictments against Captain Pedersen, Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson, and several company executives. The charges were manslaughter and conspiracy. The trial began in January 1906. It lasted 3 months. The courtroom was packed. Families of victims sat in the front rows. The prosecution argued that the defendants knew the ship was unsafe. They pointed to the history of listing. They pointed to the missing ballast. They pointed to the overcrowding. The defense argued that the disaster was an accident. They said the ship had passed all inspections. They said the captain had followed standard practice. They said no one could have predicted the roll. On March 25, 1916, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. The families wept. The defendants walked free. The decision was a shock, but it reflected the legal standards of the time. Criminal negligence required proof of intent. The prosecution had not shown that the defendants deliberately caused harm. They had only shown carelessness. Carelessness was not enough. The civil cases were different. Over 500 lawsuits were filed against the steamship company and the shipbuilders. The claims totaled millions of dollars. The cases were consolidated in federal court. The company tried to argue that the disaster was an act of God. The judge rejected that argument. He said the evidence showed clear negligence. In the end, the company settled. The total compensation paid to victims and their families was about $450,000. That was less than $500 per victim. The families received a fraction of what they had lost. The company filed for bankruptcy soon after. The ship itself was raised, repaired, and sold to the U.S. Navy. It served as a training vessel on the Great Lakes during World War I. Decades later, the hull was scrapped. The regulatory response was also uneven. In 1915, the U.S. Congress passed the Seamen's Act, which included stricter safety requirements for passenger vessels, but the law was vague. It did not mandate stability testing. It did not require continuous monitoring. It focused on lifeboats, fire safety, and crew training. The Eastland was the catalyst, but the response was incomplete. It took another disaster to force real change. In 1934, the cruise ship Morro Castle caught fire off the coast of New Jersey, killing 137 people. That fire led to stricter fireproofing regulations. In 1956, the Andrea Doria collided with another ship, killing 46 people. That collision led to improved radar and navigation standards. Each disaster spurred specific reforms, but the Eastland's lesson about stability was slow to be absorbed. In 1965, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, adopted new stability criteria for passenger ships. These criteria required calculations of the center of gravity and the metacentric height. They required simulations of flooding scenarios. They required that ships be tested before entering service. The Eastland story was cited in the working papers. It was one of the case studies that shaped the new rules. But even SOLAS did not require real-time monitoring. That would take another 50 years. In 2010, the U.S. Coast Guard began a rulemaking process for stability monitoring systems. The process was driven by a series of near misses and small ship capsizings. The Eastland was mentioned in the public comments. The rule was finalized in 2015, exactly 1 century after the disaster. It required certain passenger vessels to install sensors that calculate the stability continuously and alert the crew if the ship becomes unstable. The technology is simple. It uses pressure sensors in the ballast tanks and accelerometers on the hull. The data is fed into a computer that calculates the metacentric height in real time. If the height falls below a safe threshold, an alarm sounds. The crew can then take corrective action. It is the kind of system that would have prevented the Eastland. It is the kind of system that was proposed in 1915 but ignored. The delay is not unique to maritime safety. It is a pattern across industries. After a disaster, the immediate response is often symbolic: memorials, public apologies, pledges to do better. The deeper structural changes take decades. They require political will, industry cooperation, and sustained public pressure. The Eastland faded from public memory quickly. Other disasters took its place. The Titanic became the symbol of maritime tragedy. The Eastland became a footnote, but the footnote contains the essential lesson. The Eastland was not a rare event. It was a common event that happened in a spectacular way. The conditions that caused it, overconfidence, lack of transparency, failure to question assumptions, exist in every industry. Every hospital has a potential Eastland. Every factory, every airline, every software company. The disaster is a template for understanding how systems fail. In 1999, the naval architect who led the modern stability analysis of the Eastland, Dr. William H. Garsk, Jr., published a detailed report. He concluded that the ship could have been saved if the crew had simply filled the ballast tanks. He also concluded that the design was inherently unstable when passengers were on the upper decks. The lifeboats made it worse, but the root cause was not the ship. It was the culture. That culture persists. In 2012, the cruise ship Costa Concordia ran aground off the coast of Italy, killing 32 people. The captain abandoned ship before all passengers were evacuated. The investigation found that the crew had not followed safety procedures. The ship's stability was compromised by a collision with a reef. The captain had deviated from the planned route. The disaster was avoidable. It was a failure of culture. In 2015, a passenger ferry in South Korea, the Sewol, capsized with 304 people on board, most of them high school students. The ship was overloaded. The cargo was not secured. The crew issued a stay-in-place announcement while the ship listed. The captain escaped early. The investigation found that the regulatory system had been corrupted. The owners had cut corners. The inspectors had looked the other way. The Eastland pattern repeated itself. Each time the same questions arise. Why did no one ask the next question? Why did the crew believe the ship was safe? Why did the regulators not catch the problem? And each time the answer is the same, because the system was designed to look for obvious failures, not subtle ones. The Eastland was a subtle failure. It looked stable until it was not. Today, the memory of the Eastland is preserved by a small group of dedicated researchers and descendants. The Eastland Disaster Historical Society maintains a website and a collection of artifacts. They hold annual commemorations. They provide educational resources. They ensure that the story is not lost, but the broader public remains largely unaware. There is no major museum exhibit. There is no blockbuster film. There is no national monument. The site of the disaster is a pedestrian walkway along the Chicago River. A bronze plaque was installed in 1969. It lists the names of the victims. It was renovated in 2005. It is easy to miss. Most people walk past it without noticing, but the plaque does not need to be grand. The power of the Eastland is not in its memorial. It is in its lesson. The lesson is that safety is not a checklist. It is a mindset. It is the willingness to ask the hard questions before it is too late. It is the humility to admit that you do not know everything. It is the courage to stop a ship from sailing even if the passengers are already on board. The Eastland disaster happened on a calm morning in July 1905. It was not a storm. It was not a collision. It was not a fire. It was a ship that rolled over because the people in charge did not know what they did not know. That is the lesson, and it is still relevant. On the morning of the disaster, a young woman named Adele Olsky boarded the Eastland with her mother and sister. They planned to go to the picnic. They stood on the main deck. When the ship listed, Adele lost her grip. She fell into the water. She could not swim. She grabbed at debris. She saw her mother and sister go under. She was pulled out by a rescuer. She survived. She lived to be 92 years old. In interviews, she always said the same thing: "I never trusted a ship again." Adele's distrust was personal, but it was also rational. She had seen the system fail. She had seen the assumptions break. She had seen the ship roll. Her fear was not irrational. It was a response to a real danger. The real irrationality was the confidence of the people who thought it could not happen. The Eastland disaster is a mirror. Look into it. See your own assumptions. See your own confidence. See the gap between what you think you know and what you actually know. And then close that gap. That is the only way to keep the Eastland from happening again. At 7:30 a.m. on July 24, 1915, the Eastland was scheduled to depart from the Clark Street dock in Chicago. By 7:28, the ship had already begun to list to port. By 7:32, it had capsized. The entire event took less than 4 minutes. 844 people died. Most of them were women and children. The ship was less than 10 feet from the pier when it rolled. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in maritime history. The coroner's jury heard testimony from shipbuilders, naval architects, crew members, and passengers. They examined the design, the ballast tanks, the lifeboats, and the loading procedures. They concluded that the Eastland was unstable from the moment it was built. They also concluded that the crew did not understand the ship's behavior. They said the disaster was preventable, but prevention requires more than a report. It requires enforcement. After the Eastland, the U.S. Congress passed the Seamen's Act of 1915, which improved working conditions for sailors and required lifeboats for all passengers. The act had been pushed by Senator Robert La Follette before the disaster. The Eastland made it politically impossible to ignore. Yet the act did not solve the stability problem. It addressed the symptoms, not the cause. In the years that followed, naval architects developed new formulas for calculating stability. They introduced the concept of metacentric height, the distance between the center of gravity and the metacenter. They learned that a ship with a low metacentric height can capsize even in calm water. They learned that adding weight high above the deck, like lifeboats, can make a ship dangerously top-heavy. These lessons were not new. They had been known for decades, but the Eastland made them impossible to dismiss. The disaster also changed how the public thought about safety. Before the Eastland, people trusted that ships were safe simply because they floated. After the Eastland, they began to ask questions. They wanted to know the ship's stability test results. They wanted to see the crew's qualifications. They demanded transparency. That shift in public expectation was slow, but it was real. Today, the Eastland story is taught in maritime engineering programs. It is used as a case study in systems engineering, risk management, and organizational culture. It appears in textbooks on forensic engineering and human factors. It is analyzed by accident investigators who want to understand how a sequence of small decisions can lead to a catastrophic outcome. The Eastland is not just a tragedy, it is a lesson. The lesson is that safety is not a destination, it is a process. It requires constant questioning. It requires testing assumptions. It requires the willingness to say, "I do not know." That is hard. It is especially hard when the ship is ready to sail, when the passengers are on board, and when the schedule demands departure. But the Eastland proves that the cost of not asking is devastating. In the end, the Eastland disaster is a story about humility. It is about the engineers who thought they had designed a safe ship. It is about the inspectors who thought they had verified the design. It is about the crew who thought they had loaded the ship correctly. It is about the passengers who thought they were safe. All of them were wrong, and the ship rolled. The accident did not need to happen. It happened because no one stopped to ask the one question that could have saved everyone: what if we are wrong? That question is still the most important question in any safety system. It is the question that separates organizations that prevent disasters from organizations that wait for them. The Eastland waits no longer. It has already given its answer. The rest is up to us.